There's $800 in your checking account right now. At least, that's what your banking app says. But if you walked into your bank branch this morning and asked to withdraw all of it in cash, and everyone else in town did the same thing, your bank would run out of money before lunch. Not because they misplaced it, not because they invested it poorly, because most of that money doesn't exist. Not in any physical sense, not in any vault, not anywhere you could point to and say, there it is. And yet, you can spend it, transfer it, watch it move between accounts at the speed of electricity. It shows up on screens, gets counted in spreadsheets, determines whether you can buy a house or a car or retire with dignity. This isn't a conspiracy. It's not a glitch in the system. It's how the system was designed to work. And most people, including the ones managing the system, barely think about how strange it actually is. This is the story of how banks create money out of thin air, why they're allowed to do it, and why the whole arrangement is both more fragile and more powerful than almost anyone realizes. Let's start with what you probably learned in school. You deposit money. The bank keeps it safe. Maybe they lend some of it out to other people. They pay you a little interest, charge borrowers a bit more. Everyone wins. Clean, simple, completely wrong. Here's what actually happens. You deposit $1,000. Your account now says $1,000. Good so far. But the bank doesn't put that money in a vault with your name on it. They're not a storage facility. They're in the business of making money from money, so they lend it out. Except they don't lend out your $1,000. They lend out 900 of it, or 9,000, depends on the rules at the time. They keep a fraction in reserve, just in case you or someone else wants some cash. That fraction used to be 10%. Sometimes it's been 3%. During certain periods recently, it's been 0. But let's stick with 10% for now, because the math is cleaner. You deposit $1,000. Bank keeps 100, lends out 900 to someone else. Buying a motorcycle. Motorcycle buyer's account now shows $900. Your account still shows 1,000. Pause there. There's now $1,900 in the banking system. You created 1,000 of it by depositing actual money. The bank created 900 of it by making a loan. That 900 didn't exist before the loan was approved. It appeared the moment the bank said yes. But it gets weirder. That motorcycle buyer doesn't stuff the cash in their mattress. They send it to the motorcycle dealer. Dealer deposits it in their bank account. Now the dealer's bank has $900. They keep 90 in reserve, lend out 810 to someone else, maybe a small business owner buying equipment. Now there's $2,710 in the system from your original 1,000. The cycle continues. Each loan becomes someone else's deposit. Each deposit becomes the basis for another loan. By the time this chain reaction finishes, your original $1,000 has become $10,000 in total deposits spread across the banking system. This is called fractional reserve banking, the money multiplier effect. And it's not a secret. It's in textbooks, Federal Reserve publications, boring policy papers no one reads, but it's explained in language so technical and dry that it sounds like accounting trivia instead of what it actually is. The systematic creation of money by private institutions that are not the government. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but there are rules, regulations. Someone's keeping track of all this. And you'd be right. Sort of. Central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the U.S., set reserve requirements. These are the rules that say how much real money a bank has to keep on hand versus how much they can create through lending. For most of the 20th century, that requirement was around 10%. Reasonable enough. $1 in the vault for every $10 in accounts. Tight enough to prevent chaos. Loose enough to let banks profit. But here's where it gets interesting. In March 2020, the Federal Reserve dropped the reserve requirement to 0, not 0.5%, not some tiny fraction, 0. Banks could lend out 100% of their deposits if they wanted to, nothing holding them back except their own risk management and capital requirements, which are a different thing entirely. The official reason was to give banks more flexibility during a pandemic-induced financial crisis, keep credit flowing, prevent a collapse, noble goal. But it also meant the theoretical limit on money creation just vanished. Now, banks didn't go crazy. They didn't suddenly start lending recklessly. Most of them stayed cautious. But the point is they could have. The guardrail was gone. And it's still gone. As of now, there's no reserve requirement in the United States. Most people don't know this. Why would they? It wasn't announced with fireworks. Just a technical adjustment in a footnote during a chaotic year. But it represents one of the most significant changes in how money works in nearly a century. And almost no one noticed. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about what money actually is. You probably think of it as something solid, something with weight and history, gold coins, paper bills, things you can touch. And for most of human history, that was true. Money was stuff, shells, salt, metal, bits of shiny rock that everyone agreed were valuable. Then came banks, and banks realized something clever. Most people don't actually want their money all the time. They want the ability to access it, the promise, the number on a page. So banks started issuing more promises than they had gold to back up. And as long as everyone didn't ask for their gold at once, it worked fine.
This was the birth of fractional reserve banking. It wasn't designed by economists in a conference room. It emerged organically because it was profitable. Banks discovered they could lend out money they didn't fully have and charge interest on it. Free revenue. As long as confidence held, the system scaled beautifully. But confidence is fragile. When people lose faith, when they think the bank might not have their money, they rush to withdraw it all at once. That's called a bank run. And when a bank run happens, it doesn't matter how healthy the bank's books look on paper. If they've lent out 90% of their deposits and everyone wants cash today, the bank fails. Period. This happened over and over again throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Panics in 1873, 1893, 1907, banks collapsing like dominoes, people losing everything, not because the banks were fraudulent, but because the system itself was built on a contradiction. You can't promise everyone their money back immediately, while simultaneously lending most of it out long term. It's mathematically impossible, but we do it anyway, and we've gotten very good at pretending it's not a problem.
The solution, or at least the patch, came in the form of central banking and deposit insurance. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, specifically to act as a lender of last resort. When banks run short on cash, the Fed can step in and lend them money to cover withdrawals. This stops bank runs before they spiral into full collapse. Confidence is restored. The system stabilizes. Then, in 1933, after the Great Depression shattered what was left of trust in banks, the U.S. government created the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Your deposits, up to a certain amount, are now guaranteed by the government. Even if your bank fails, you get your money back, up to $250,000 per account currently. This was brilliant. It worked. Bank runs mostly stopped. People stopped panicking. The system stabilized for decades. But here's the trade-off no one talks about. By guaranteeing deposits, the government essentially backstops the entire fractional reserve system. Banks can create money through lending, keep only a sliver in reserve, and if things go wrong, taxpayers cover the losses. Heads they win, tails we lose. And because people know their deposits are insured, they stop paying attention to whether their bank is actually solvent. Why would you? Your money's guaranteed. So banks face less market discipline. They can take bigger risks, lend more aggressively, because the downside is socialized. This isn't theory. We've seen it happen. 2008 financial crisis. Banks lent recklessly, created mortgage-backed securities based on loans that should never have been made. And when it all collapsed, the government stepped in with hundreds of billions in bailouts. The system was saved. The banks survived. And the money creation machine kept running, because stopping it would be worse. From there, the scale explodes. Money supply growth, quantitative easing, asset inflation, rising inequality. Banks fail. Governments intervene. Confidence is protected at all costs. Silicon Valley Bank collapses. Deposits are guaranteed. The system holds. But the core fragility remains. The whole thing runs on belief. The belief that your money is there, even though it mostly isn't. The belief that loans will be repaid, that confidence will hold, that the next crisis can be managed. And most of the time, it works. But every so often, people remember the truth, that money is not a physical thing. It's an agreement, a promise, a collective story we all participate in. Banks don't just store money. They create it through loans, through promises, through saying yes. And that power shapes everything. Who gets rich? Who falls behind? Who owns assets? Who rents forever? Next time you check your bank balance, remember that number exists because a bank created it, because someone borrowed it into existence, because we all agreed to believe. And as long as we keep believing, it keeps working. The real question isn't whether the system will last forever. Nothing does. The question is what happens the day people stop believing.